Everybody, give us a few minutes to fill up folks from our waiting room. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm so excited. I can hardly stand it today with our speaker. So I'll ramble a little bit about myself before I just turn it over to our outstanding speaker today while people are coming into our Zoom room. This is a fantastic turnout. I'm Shanta Zimmer. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Medical Education here at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Welcome to those of you who are joining us from other institutions today. I'm also the Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and one of the co-directors of this Grand Rounds program. We are excited today to be celebrating Juneteenth on our campus, and I know that some folks had to make a difficult decision about which events to attend today, so we're really excited that you chose to be here. I think when we think about equity and we think about our move towards our goals of inclusive excellence on this campus, making choices like this one to attend something where you learn some way to be actionable about your intentions around diversity and inclusion is an important step as well. So these events are meant to capture the attention of educators, but I think today's topic is one that crosses many aspects of our life in academia. Dr. Jennifer Spicer is here today from Emory University, where she is an assistant professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases. Jen has an MD and an MPH from Emory University, which is also my alma mater, and it should be no surprise to her or any of you that after you hear her talk today that I've tried to recruit her to wherever I am at almost every step of my career. Her primary interest is in medical education, and she's currently completing a master's degree in health professions education at the University of Illinois, Chicago, while simultaneously holding several educational leadership roles at Emory, including a course director in the medical school, director of the Distinction in Medical Education program for the internal medicine residency, and subspecialty curriculum lead for the IM program. She's also active in the Infectious Disease Society of America and is the recipient of multiple teaching awards, both as a student, a trainee, and now as a junior faculty member as well. Jennifer's talk on the myth of meritocracy is something that all of us need to be thinking about, and I think is going to stimulate an outstanding discussion as well. Thanks for being with us today, Jen. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Shanta, for that kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here today. So today, what I will be talking about is the myth of meritocracy and trying to think how we can operationalize this to make our selection processes better. So first, I want to start with gratitude. These are some of the individuals in my ID division who helped me when I was first developing this talk for our own division to think very critically about some of the content that I was including. And in particular, Wendy Armstrong and Kimberly Manning both attended my talk and gave me excellent feedback on how to improve it, because I'm always trying to improve and change things each time that I do it. And Kimberly in particular is part of the reason that I'm here today, because she advertised my talk on Twitter after listening to it, and I really appreciate her sponsorship. So today, the learning objectives are to recognize that diversity and excellence are intertwining rather than competing concepts, explain why our current selection processes continue to perpetuate inequity, and to describe some individual and system level changes that we can make to promote equity in our processes. So I want to start with a disclaimer that this is not a comprehensive overview. This is intended to really start a discussion about the processes that we currently use. And I also want to add that I recognize that I'm a white woman from Macon, Georgia. I grew up in a two-physician household, and I have had a lot of privilege in my life. I have actually benefited from the way that we currently do selection processes. And I think that it's important to reflect on that for all of us. And so some people may wonder why I'm giving this talk, but I think it's really important that we are all engaged in conversations about this content. So today I'm going to start with talking about an introduction of some of these concepts and how they intertwine. And then I want to delve into some of the inequity that currently exists in our selection processes, specifically focusing on the metrics that we currently use and how our interactions with applicants may perpetuate this issue. And then I want to close with some concrete examples of what some places have done and the results that they have seen. So first, all of us here are familiar with the concept that racial inequity persists among medical students, but I think that this graph is particularly stark in that things have not changed over time. So this is a graph showing the representation quotient, showing how our student bodies compare to the general population. And here it's very clear that the number of people underrepresented in medicine, and that includes Black, Hispanic, American Indian, and Native American, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students, they remain lower than the general population, and that has persisted over the last 2 decades, despite us discussing this issue. But more than that, medical students also come from a very wealthy background. And we know this, but I think don't discuss it as much as we should be. So if you look at the quintiles of US household incomes, you'll see that medical students represent 50% of our medical students represent the top 5th quintile of household incomes, and that about half of those have parental incomes in the top 1% of US households. So again, not representative of the individuals that we are serving. So why does this diversity persist despite us talking about it? Well, in a lot of the conversations, we talk about diversity and excellence as competing concepts. We want diversity, but then we always have discussions about people needing to meet the metrics or the criteria that we put in place. And whenever we end up having these discussions, we always let excellence win out. But what I would like to argue here is that really diversity has been shown to lead to excellence. This is well documented in the literature. And so in fact, by putting diversity as one of the first criteria that we look at, we will achieve excellence. So there are many, many examples in the literature showing that diversity improves outcomes. So we know it improves patient outcomes. It increases innovation among teams. The more diverse your team is, the more perspectives that you have to think about new ways of doing things. And for research, it's been shown to increase both the number of publications that a team puts out, but also the number of citations that they get. So regardless of if we're involved in the clinical setting, education setting, or research, diversity should be one of the top things that we are working towards increasing. So again, we should aim to maximize this diversity, especially in the clinical setting where we are serving a diverse population. And up until now, I haven't really defined what I mean by diversity. I've talked a little bit about race and a little bit about income, but really we should be increasing diversity in all aspects. So ethnicity, nationality, geographic spread, we should be looking at people coming from urban and rural areas. We should be thinking about people who have disabilities, about sexual orientation and gender identity, religious views, political views. Increasing diversity in all of these aspects is going to help us better serve our patients. So when we're talking about how can we increase diversity in medicine, we have to think about a variety of different steps in different areas where we know diversity can fall off. So first, there has to be the pipeline, or the individuals who are actually able to have the opportunities that allow them to apply to medical school or to awards or apply to grants. We need to be able to recruit those individuals, select them, and then retain them. There are interventions that you can do across this entire spectrum, but today what I want to focus on is the selection process. And when I talk about the selection process, I'm really talking about this in a very broad way. So regardless of what you're involved in, whether it's training programs is where we typically think about it, or medical school admissions, but this applies to faculty positions too, in recruiting new faculty. It applies to leadership positions and thinking about how do we select a new clerkship director or a new dean or a new chair of a department. How do we select who receives awards, whether that's research awards, teaching awards? What does that process look like? And how do we select people for grants or other types of funding? So again, we should look at all of these processes and think about the concepts that we're discussing today for each of these. So in general, we've built selection processes to promote the concept of meritocracy, that those who have the abilities and who have demonstrated that they can do well are the ones who should be selected for those processes. And we are thinking that by measuring all of these things for an individual, we are able to predict who will be successful. So I want you to ask yourself the following questions. For whatever selection process you're part of, how do you define what a successful applicant is? What does that look like? What are those criteria that you use to define that when you're interviewing and selecting people for that role? And finally, how well do you think those criteria predict success in the role? And as I discuss things today, what I want us to come back to is reflecting on this at the end of the session. So sources of inequity exist in our selection processes, and I want to focus on two distinct areas. One are the metrics that we use to measure the different criteria that we select, and the second is thinking about the interpersonal interactions that we have with people applying to roles. So let's delve into some of these metrics that we use. So today I'm going to focus specifically on admissions to training programs for a lot of my examples, because that's something that all of us are familiar with to some extent, whether it is as an applicant or as somebody involved in the selection process. So I want you to briefly look at these two applicants and just think to yourself what their chances are of being accepted to a residency program. We have the top applicant who went to a well-known medical school, is in AOA, many leadership positions, first author publications, great recommendations. And another applicant who went to a state school that's less well-known, doesn't have as much on their CV. And so think about what you would initially have an impression of if you looked at this application. And now I want to think a little bit more about each of these applicants and how the differing aspects of these applications may not actually represent differences in their abilities, but rather differences in the opportunities and resources that they've had, or what's termed in the literature the capital that they've had to work with. So we can think about economic capital or the financial resources that somebody has. Did an applicant have to work to pay for school? Did they come from a family where they actually had to work part-time to help support their family too? Did that leave them time to be able to volunteer or to do research in their free time? Did they have the money to pay for test prep courses, which have been shown to increase scores on standardized exams? What about their social capital? Who is in their social network? Do they know people who are physicians? When they were going through high school and college, did they have the opportunity to volunteer? Did they have people who could connect them to potential research mentors? At their institution, do they even have potential mentors in their area of interest? What about their cultural capital? This is kind of the know-how of how things work. And for a first generation applicant, do they know like what is required to apply to medical school or to apply to any of these positions, the unwritten rules of what's expected? Do they know and have they received coaching in how to respond to interview questions appropriately? All of those things may play a role into what their application looks like. And finally, symbolic capital, which I think we don't discuss enough. This is kind of the social status that's afforded to somebody based on their experiences. So there is certain name recognition that goes with various schools. There's name recognition that goes with various individuals in the field. And I can say that looking at letters, if it's somebody that I know writing a letter of recommendation, I view that differently when I don't know someone. And so how does that disadvantage applicants when I'm looking at their application? So again, I think it's important for us to remember that these differences in opportunities and resources impact people's appearance on applications, but it does not show that they have difference in their abilities. So I'd like to propose that this concept of meritocracy is a myth. And it's something that has been discussed a lot in the lay press. There are many books on the concept, but if you just look at this definition, I think we can start to break it down. And again, this is their demonstrated abilities and merit. Did they have those equal resources and opportunities like we discussed? Those abilities and merits that we're measuring or looking at, who defined those? What are their worldviews or perspectives or experiences? And the metrics that we've chosen, do they actually predict things we care about? Do they predict who is going to be a successful researcher or a successful faculty member or a good doctor? And who are the ones doing the selection? Who's choosing? What does that group look like? What are their experiences and perspectives? So I think this is hard because we live in the US and we have come to be raised to believe in the American dream, right? That anybody can get to where they want if they just work hard. And we use examples, anecdotes of exception to say things like, racism doesn't exist anymore. These barriers are not there. But that's not true. It is hard for us to achieve things without the proper resources and opportunities. But I think this is really hard for us, right? Because this requires people like me to look in the mirror and recognize that I have had a lot of privilege to get where I am, a lot of luck. Yes, I've worked hard. It does not take away the fact that I've worked hard, but other people who have worked equally hard may not be able to have gotten where I have gotten. So let's delve into these metrics and think a little bit more carefully about the evidence of how valid these metrics are, but also do they perpetuate any inequity? So this is a survey from internal medicine program directors that was done back in 2009, asking them which metrics they use and how important they think those metrics are. So you can see a list here of things that are very familiar and present in applications. And I've highlighted in orange all of the ones that are predominantly based on medical knowledge. So this is what they are trying to predict. And you can see all the ACGME core competencies that are left out of the criteria that we're using to predict who is going to be successful and who we want to bring into our training programs. And many of those metrics we use, unfortunately, don't meet validity standards that are set up in medical education. So I like to think of metrics by defining their utility. And that's a combination of how valid they are, which is how accurate they are, versus their feasibility. Because we all recognize that, the tough thing is, can we pick things that are feasible for us to actually measure? So for this first point, I really want to focus on the validity. And I want to focus on two concepts within validity. That is extrapolation, or how well do these metrics predict things we care about, and the consequences. So are there any adverse consequences from us using these metrics? Specifically, do they perpetuate inequity? So I'm going to start with letters of recommendation. And the medical student performance evaluation is where we have more data. This is thought to be a more standardized representation of that is more objective, more similar across students. But I know that those of us who have read it recognize that there are some issues and limitations with that too. But with the data that we have on letters of recommendation, how well does it predict things we care about? So how well does it predict future performance on exams like boards? It does not predict or correlate with future board scores. What about with an individual's clinical care? Currently, the evidence shows that it does not predict someone's clinical care. So we don't know if this is very accurate or helpful, but does it result in inequity? Because we need to look at that piece too. And there are numerous studies showing that there is biased language associated with different demographic factors. We know that especially in the MSPEs, there are fewer standout terms like excellent or outstanding that are applied to Black, Asian, and Hispanic students. And for women, there are more comments about compassion rather than ability. And I think the hard thing with this is like compassion isn't a bad thing. We should be commenting on somebody's compassion, but we also should be commenting on someone's ability. And so the issue is really this disparate way that we describe different people. It's not about the terms we use or what we describe, but if there is systematic differences between these demographic factors, then there's something we need to look at. So what about awards? And specifically here, we have the most data on AOA. Does it predict what we care about? Does it predict future board scores or in-training exams, things like that? So there is maybe some evidence with correlation, and part of that actually goes with how we pick people for AOA, which requires a certain academic standing. What about clinical care? The data is variable. Some shows it doesn't predict. There's one study among orthopedic residents showing that it correlated with faculty clinical evaluations later, but not an abundance of evidence and more evidence showing no correlation. So does it result in inequity? There are, again, numerous studies looking at demographic factors being associated with lower acceptance rates into AOA, again, disadvantaging the same populations. But I think what's more interesting about these studies to me is we tend to think of AOA as showing kind of leaders or people who are professionals, trying to measure some of those intangible qualities. But actually, AOA status is not associated with community service hours done, leadership hours, leadership positions. So it's not measuring those intangibles either. It's mostly a proxy for academic success. All right, so what about standardized exams? This is something that we use a lot and something that's been hotly debated for the past couple of years. And most of the data I'm going to talk about are in regards to the USMLE. So does it predict what we care about? So a little questionable whether it predicts exams. So it does predict if you make a higher score on USMLE, it correlates with higher scores on future exams. But the reason I have a question mark here is that for boards, we measure those pass-fail. And so what's really more predictive is if you pass USMLE exams, you pass boards. And so the way we use it does not correlate with the way that we are supposed to use it. What about clinical outcomes? So again, looking at things like in training evaluations later on and things like that, board scores have mixed associations with some of those measures, some showing actually negative correlations, some showing positive, and some showing no correlation at all. What about inequity? So there are numerous studies showing that, again, demographic factors are associated with worse performance, many of which I've mentioned, but also US citizens do worse. And that's actually probably not surprising, because this is really important to people who are international medical grads, for people to even look at their application, right? So they put more time and effort into studying for it, more money into studying for it. But also age is predictive. So the higher your age is above average, the worse you score. Again, this is predicting maybe test taking ability rather than other things. I'd also like to point out that the USMLE lacks discriminatory power. So this is a more recent picture of one of the performance scores that applicants receive back. I got this from Brian Carmody's blog. He has written extensively about USMLE. And you'll notice this little text at the bottom that didn't used to exist there. It's not on my old score reports, but it says, if you tested repeatedly, your score would fall within one standard error of the estimate of your current score 2/3 of the time. It gives you the standard error of the estimate. So that means your real score is between 197 and 213 if you were to take it again the same day. I think, to me, this is really striking, because it means that there needs to be a 16-point difference for there to even be a statistically meaningful difference between scores. And that doesn't even get to the fact, is it clinically meaningful? Does it predict what we actually care about if you get a higher exam score? So this has really made me step back from even looking too closely at differences between step 2 CK exam scores. And if you're interested in the USMLE debate, I don't have time to go into depth. It's fascinating. And this is a phenomenal talk on YouTube that Brian Carmody gave, which is excellent. And I highly recommend it. So the bottom line is, our current selection criteria lack validity, they lack discriminatory power, and perpetuate systemic inequity. And so it's really this makes me feel really bad now, and it's really hard to figure out, how do we move forward? So let's talk about some solutions we can actually use. So one thing that's been proposed is to just have a lottery, which sounds a little crazy, but is probably not as far-fetched as we make it seem, because the problem is we're overemphasizing all of these marginal differences between applications, which results in persistent disparities. And it also makes it hard for medical students who are working as hard as they can to have any leg up. Same with residents, for fellowship, and for other things. Now, this is a pretty radical concept, so I don't have any imagination this is going to happen anytime soon, but there are different things that we can do, and holistic review has been discussed a lot recently. And the general idea is we need to use a broad range of relevant criteria. And these need to be matched to our program's mission. Programs should have different missions. What type of physician are they trying to develop? What experiences, competencies, and attributes and metrics would help predict that? So the AAMC has a great website on this, and they have a worksheet that I will show. So again, whenever you're picking these different characteristics, thinking about how it impacts diversity is important. So here is a sample of one of the tables from their worksheet. So you can see it has a group sit down and think about different experiences applicants may have, and which of these are important. Distance traveled, healthcare experience, serving in a medically underserved area, community or volunteer service. So again, deciding as a program how important these things are. What attributes match your mission? Things like intellectual curiosity, integrity, having proficiency in different languages that are spoken by the patient population, being a team player. What competencies are important? And then finally, what metrics are important? And thinking about the degree of importance, all of this will help define what should we actually be looking at in our selection processes. Instead of automatically looking at all of the data we get, let's be intentional about it. And once we've decided those criteria, it's helpful to then define them, because we know that developing clear, unambiguous definitions helps to mitigate implicit bias. So we define them, and then we think about how can we assess it in a feasible way, right? Some of this stuff is really hard for us to measure. So that requires some brainstorming and thinking about it. And maybe something doesn't exist right now and something should be developed if that's really important to the program. But we need to make sure whatever we're using to assess that is actually valid and helpful. So on the handout that you will receive via email for this lecture will be posted on the link, I've included some really helpful references, including 3 systematic reviews and meta-analyses about different selection strategies that can be used. So next, only providing relevant data to interviewers or to the committee. So there are studies showing that things like photos bias us. Okay, so should we be showing the photos? Should we not? That should be a decision that we really carefully make. What about exam scores? So once we've gone through maybe a screening process, making sure people have passed exams before, or even if you have a cutoff that you use for your program, do the interviewers need to see those exam scores? Will that maybe bias their impression of an applicant during the interview process? And the most important thing, even though I'm listing this last, this is the most fundamental, is that there is a diverse committee making these decisions. Because we all have blind spots and we all have things that we haven't thought about before if we have not dealt with our own issues or adversity. And so I think it's really important that we bring people with different perspectives together to discuss this. All right, so let's move on and talk about interactions with applicants and some of the issues that exist and then the solutions. So we all have implicit biases that impact our decisions, and I'm not going to go into discussing implicit bias and what it is during this talk. This talk by Dr. Quinn Capers is great, and it's on YouTube for anybody interested, but he talks about how our implicit bias shapes how we see everybody. So when we see a nun or a Black man in a hoodie, what is our initial impression, even if those people were doing the exact same thing? And so his talk is incredibly powerful for anybody who hasn't heard, and I highly recommend it. So we just need to recognize we all have a different lens, right? And that's been shaped by our beliefs and experiences. So what media have we been exposed to? What movies, what newspapers? What was our education and upbringing like? Who do we see at the grocery store when we go? What exists in our neighborhood? And where have we traveled and who have we been exposed to? So all of these things are going to shape our lens. We are all unique individuals with different experiences. And likeness bias impacts our interpretations. This is something I've become really cognizant of this year during the application process last fall. People we have similarities with, we bond with in a different way, and that actually allows us to overlook things that we may not overlook with another applicant. So it's actually a positive bias that we need to make sure that we kind of look again objectively at an applicant's materials. And so positive biases can be good, but they can also disadvantage others who don't share those similarities. So then how can we go about rectifying these issues? What solutions exist? Because some of these things are really hard for us to do anything about. So again, the most important thing is involving a really diverse group of individuals. So think about the role you're looking at, whether it is medical student admissions, whether it is for residency, for fellowship, for an award, for grants. What do you want that group of individuals to look like? What kind of diversity are you interested in having? And your committee should look like that group, because that is going to help bring in more diverse individuals. During the interview process or any interpersonal interactions, we want to mitigate the potential implicit biases that can occur in whatever way we can. So having a diverse group helps with that because everybody has different biases, but also having a standardized interview process. So what this may look like during the interview is structured behavioral interviews, which have become pretty popular and are used at a lot of places, but not everywhere. This prevents a little bit more of the variability within the interview. And multiple mini interviews are something that have been done a lot in the UK and in Australia, and I think in Canada too, especially McMaster University. I've seen studies coming out of there, but this is a concept of basically having multiple OSCE stations almost that are like interviews. And so each small 5 to 8 minute session has a goal. So sometimes this is things even like procedural skills. But it varies depending on what's been set up by the program. And so these have to be validated. There needs to be a diverse group of individuals thinking about it, but it has been shown to be acceptable to candidates if it's done at a lot of places, right? So you can imagine how this could be really intimidating for people who don't know much about it, but people do feel like it's a much more fair way of doing things, and you interact with a larger variety of people. Now, thinking about the rating form, so I know at least in the programs that I work with, we fill out rating forms after the interview. So for example, maybe you're asked to rate someone's leadership skills. And I have had forms that look like this. And this is really hard, right? Like, what does a 4 mean? What does a 5 mean? What does a 7 mean? And I know my internal calibration, but how does that differ from what someone else is putting on the form? So having a scale like this can be problematic. There is poor inter-rater reliability with it. And so a better way to do it is to make really clear anchors to select. So one example could be you quantify the number of activities. Now, we know quantifying stuff that is qualitative can be really difficult, but it at least gives people something to discuss and talk about that's a little bit more standardized. It's important that we increase our own awareness of our biases, and implicit association tests have been something that have been promoted and proposed at a lot of places. The QR code here will take you to a variety of implicit association tests, some of which I've put here. This is just one step, right? This is not like a fix. Everybody does this and it's fine. But I think that it can help us recognize where we may have implicit biases. And it's hard because you take some of these and you're like, but I don't feel like I have that bias. But again, this is just how we've been raised, what we have seen in our lives. And so we shouldn't feel bad about it. We should do this to figure out how we can mitigate those biases. And start thinking about things like, who do you select for opportunities? How diverse are your mentees? Who co-authors papers with you? Who do you sponsor for talks? Who do you recommend for awards? And when you're rating people, whether that is grading them or evaluations, are there systematic differences? So do you see differences between gender or race in their clinical evaluations? What about your narrative comments or your letters of recommendation? What about your ratings and interviews? And how do your ratings compare to other raters? So lastly, we can check our biases before decisions. So things that we can do and ask ourselves before we put a number on a rating form is to consider the opposite. So we have an impression maybe that somebody is a great candidate, they have a lot of leadership opportunities. Like, let's re-review the data and look for evidence supporting the opposing impression. Or if you have a negative impression about an applicant, looking and seeing if you can find things that support the opposite view. Thinking of a counter-stereotypical exemplar. So this is thinking about an individual you admire from the same demographic group. Doing this before an interview can be something that helps you rate differently and combat implicit biases. I talked about likeness bias, so we can use this the same way, right? So somebody who maybe looks different from us, but we have a similarity, use that for common identity formation, and that helps to combat any potential negative implicit biases. And then perspective taking. So again, empathize with the individual by thinking about like what it was like to grow up or have the experiences that they had. So there's evidence for each of these. I have a QR code linking to some of the studies showing that these have a benefit. And as I mentioned, comparing ratings to other individuals, but also to your own average. So if you know your average rating, think about, did you fairly rate that participant? And whenever you write narrative comments, have you used biased language? So I have started putting all of my narrative comments into, for men and women, the gender bias calculator, and I try to look if I have female or male associated words. And this is something that unfortunately doesn't exist for other demographic groups to help with, but I have found it tremendously helpful because a lot of my language is biased against women too, right? I mean, this has to do with how we've grown up in society and societal expectations. So I have found this really helpful personally. And UCSF has a great faculty guide with some examples of common biases and stereotypes in evaluations. So I also look at this before writing. All right, so I want to close with a couple examples. So to ensure diversity, it's really important that we collect data and see if the changes that we make have the desired impact. So this is measuring the number who applied to a position, were offered an interview, accepted it, accepted a job. So again, this will help you see where along the spectrum are you having more issues with diversity. Is it you don't have enough applying, that you aren't offering enough interviews, or you're offering and even accepting them, but not enough are coming? And this can help change things for the future. So here's an example of changes for AOA selection. So they use some of the things I've talked about, diversifying the committee membership, making really explicit selection criteria and training people on how to apply those criteria, and widening the criteria that they use, increasing student eligibility with the application. So again, not having such a high cutoff for academic achievement, especially since that's not necessarily the main goal of AOA selection. And then blinding review of applications, so people don't know who it is. And they have seen numbers increase for underrepresented in medicine candidates substantially after doing this process. So a pediatric residency program implemented a number of changes. So some at the individual interpersonal level, mandatory training, case discussions, having smaller ranking teams, no photos during ranking, a variety of things. And then at the system level, they revised rubrics, they changed what selection criteria they were using, expanded the ranking committee, and set explicit goals for recruitment. And again, in 2 years, saw a dramatic increase in the number of interns who were underrepresented in medicine. And a faculty recruitment for a surgery program that was really having difficulty with diversity, did a number of things. So they changed how they advertised positions. They changed requirements to have a diverse applicant pool. They looked at who was participating in the process. They changed their interview process to make it a little bit more standardized, in addition to more of the recruitment interviews. And they changed how the hiring decision was made. It wasn't just departmental leaders, but also recommendations from the committee. And after they implemented this, the following year, they had 8 new faculty, 33% underrepresented in medicine, and women at 50%, which was drastically different from what had happened in previous years. So some take-home points. First, I hope that I've convinced you diversity drives excellence. It's really not a competing concept. And there is a lot of literature on this that I'm happy to share. We need to ensure that our selection metrics are valid and equitable. Combining individual training with better selection processes is important. You can't just do individual training or just the selection processes. Doing both is helpful. And that changing these processes has been shown to increase diversity. I only showed 3 case studies There are many more, and I have included some on the handout in different categories in case you want to look at kind of the nitty-gritty of how other places did it. And finally, I just want to recognize we can't eliminate all bias, right? Like, we should not have that as our goal because it's impossible, but we can mitigate systemic bias, and that should be our goal. So for homework, I'm a really big fan. I'm an educator, and so I love homework. I just want all of us to reflect on what are our biases. Look at some data, look at the last letter of recommendation you wrote. Think about how we can mitigate those biases. Like, what process are you going to change in how you do evaluations or interviews or letter of recommendations? Just one small change is even helpful. And then what are you part of? What selection process where you can propose a change and start this discussion? Because I can tell you that after giving this talk at my division, it has led to us discussing changes for a lot of different areas. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was such an awesome talk. I was frantically writing notes down the whole time. We have a few questions from the chat that we'll start with since we have time.
Okay.
So the first one was from Lauren Heary, and it says, what interventions exist for improving geographic diversity in residency applicants and selection? It seems like this is a potential source of bias. Applicants are perceived as unlikely to rank a program because they haven't lived there, don't have ties to a place, when it actually may be their top choice. And that there seems to be sort of a generational mindset that you wouldn't move for a job, and whereas maybe millennials are much more likely to do this, but older generations are less likely.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I am not familiar with seeing specific interventions in the literature around this, but just thinking from my own experiences and also discussing a lot with applicants about this, I think that the key thing is support and showing that a program is going to be able to provide social support, because that's what many people are worried about now. They hear residency's hard, they want to try to have kids, and how can they do that in the course of their training? How will they be supported? How are they going to be able to meet new people in that network? And so I think that that is one thing that we can tangibly do to try to make sure people know what social support exists and strengthen that. And then when people come and they interview at a place and they hear residents from other places say how happy they are there, I think that that helps a lot. But the geographic diversity is a tough thing. And sometimes, like, it is nice to be in the same place and train in the same areas. So I think we do what we can. But I think some of these other areas of diversity are probably the bigger focus that we should have over the geographic diversity.
Awesome. The next question was from Von Samedi. For the final selection of an applicant, any suggestions on which we should weigh more between the application review itself or interview performance?
That's a great question. So a lot of what's been discussed in the literature and the recommendation is, the application review is more of kind of a screening process to decide, who kind of fits with the program, not in terms of like cultural fit, which I think is how we usually use the term, but again, who has the experiences and attributes that you're looking for. But I think after that, again, you've kind of created a collection of individuals that would all be good candidates. And so I think at that point, weighing the interview more is probably helpful, but I think that there's arguments to do it anyway. But I think this is where diversity should come in actually as a really high priority when you're looking at that pool of people after the interview, right? Because again, you're looking at people who all met the criteria that you were interested in, you've gotten to know them. But unless there's red flags, I think diversity should be really high on the list of what you're moving towards.
That makes good sense. Next is Brad Cottrell. Sorry, Brad, I hope I said that right. With the upcoming changes in USMLE to pass fail, what are your thoughts on how that will impact the selection process? As you demonstrated, it was a flawed metric, but do have concerns that it will that what will replace it may be even more flawed and potentially even more opaque for applicants to know what's being used. Any thoughts on how to prepare for this or address the vacuum to fill with better metrics that are both valid and feasible?
Thanks,
That's a
Brad.
great question, Brad.
Thanks, Brad, and great to see you here. I think that's the $1 million question, right, that everybody's asking. But after spending a lot of time in this literature, I really think that what I'm worried is going to happen is that step 2 CK is going to take on a larger role. And although it does have a little bit more validity in thinking about, like, is it extrapolating to what we care about? It's still only about medical knowledge. And I think that what happens is we know that it is inequitable, right? We know that using that as a screening tool actually screens out a lot of people who are underrepresented in medicine for the resource issues that I've discussed. And so I personally think that it should be used for what it was intended, which was a pass-fail test, is the only way we should use it as a metric. That's what it was validated for. That's what it was created for. Now, I know this creates a ton of issues with reviewing large number of applications, right? But I just don't think that it's doing anything better for us. And so I think it is important that we are upfront with applicants about what are our selection processes. And I don't know the best way to do that, but I do think we should be more upfront about this. And we just have to recognize that just like luck and resources and opportunity is what leads to some of the chance right now, there's always going to be that aspect of we have highly qualified people competing for jobs. There is an aspect of chance, but we need to push again to increase the diversity within that chance. I don't know if that answers, but this is the question we're all struggling with, I think.
The next is from Linda Montgomery. Do you know if there's any discussion of how we might change the NRP timeline to better support holistic review? It does feel like an arms race when over 1,000 applicants at our program and you're under the gun to get interview invitations out within a week. And it's easy to filter for like AOA and step scores. Yeah. Oh, the questions are flooding in. So any suggestions on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's the tough thing. And that's why we're doing this, right? Like that is why we use those metrics, because there's just so much to review. I do not know, I'm not involved in kind of any of the organizations that are discussing that, but I really think that that is what should be done. Because we need more holistic review. We need to think about new ways to do this, because screening out via those metrics is not helping anybody. It's not helping the applicants. It's not helping the programs. And so we really need to think about a different way to do it.
Next was from Brad again. When you have such a large faculty and academic medical center, faculty development on effective letter writing, interview selection, it's all very challenging. I'll quote, "We don't all have a faculty of Jen Spicer clones." Any examples of academic centers that have tried to do a smaller, diverse group with protected time where they can really focus on writing letters and evaluating the applicants during the selection process?
I am not sure of examples in the literature, to be honest. I feel like there's probably some that exist. But the other thing I wonder is, even just as a faculty member, when I came in, nobody provided me with resources on how to write a letter of recommendation, right? I started having people approach me, and then I started like looking and asking people and getting examples. But I think like even simple things like just having a document that tells new faculty how to do this, because especially for those of us who are younger faculty who haven't done much of this, we may inadvertently be using some of those like bad phrases in our letters in an applicant that we think is fantastic. And this has actually happened to some of our applicants applying from our school when other people reviewed their letters. And so I think that even just starting with a simple document of best practices for some of this stuff and pushing that to people who are involved in the process can be helpful. Making it short, concise with best practices is probably the best we can do, unless and until we can get support for people.
Next question was from Jason Kaufenbach. Regarding recommendation to avoid including the applicant photos, do you recommend that at each level, application review and interview? Asking because we're a small program and it helps us to remember the 20 to 25 applicants who we interview. And could it hurt diversity considerations because we are treating applicants as data on paper?
Yeah, I do think that that's one of the challenges. And I haven't seen this addressed very well in the literature. Like, there are studies definitely showing, especially weight, as being a factor in just like, I don't know how they measure in the studies, but like general appearance and like attractiveness impacting how people do. And so, I do think we want diversity, right? So we have to make sure we're getting that. And I don't know where the best place is. That's something that we're struggling with this year for the interviews, because it often helps to remember somebody you interviewed. And so maybe instead of everybody on the ranking committee or when you're meeting as a committee seeing the picture, maybe just the people who interviewed, who again need to remember that person, but not the whole committee, right? Because that's just adding another data point they don't need. But the person who interviewed and who can speak for that can bring up the diversity issue. So I think that's something to consider. And also just for people to be aware of the biases that come into play with the images when you do use them.
I think we'll probably have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to come to a close. As we look, this is from Kwanzaa Devlin. As we look to change what we are doing with admissions, it seems that it will take time to know if changes really are working. Do the doctors match what we value? Are there any recommendations to assess the success of our changes in the short term? Great question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that what we know, more than like, we don't know whether these metrics predict good doctors, right? Like, despite having them for a really long time and measuring them, there is variable evidence. And also, like, how do we measure who's a good doctor? Like, that's one of the issues in the literature, right? So I think the best way is we need to maximize diversity because we have lots of evidence that diversity matters. So what we can measure is diversity. And that is what some of these programs have measured. But I think what we have to be careful about is to make sure that we are not just achieving surface diversity, right? So we don't want to just have what looks like a diverse applicant pool, but like, are they really economically diverse, right? Or are we just selecting people from different racial and ethnic categories, but who still kind of fit the privileged background? So I think it's important for us to think about diversity in multiple levels with that. But I think it's measuring these diversity demographic measures is what we can do first, because that has been shown to result in better outcomes.
All right, that's the end. I see some silent, muted virtual applause. It's an awesome talk. It looks like Erin has posted our evaluation form, and that you can fill that out to give Dr. Spicer feedback, but also get your CME credits. And thank you so much, Dr. Spicer. It's really been a pleasure. It's a really fantastic talk.
Yes, and thank you.
Follow Dr. Spicer on Twitter.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really fantastic to have you here today. And this is perfect for us as we're, thinking about all of our recruitment process. You gave us lots of very practical things, and I appreciate so much the grounding in the evidence as well. So thanks for joining us all the way from Atlanta. We hope to have you here in person sometime.
Great. Thank you for having me, everyone.